There are stories in Hollywood, whispered in the corridors of old studios, that have become modern folklore. They are tales of immense talent, of meteoric rises, and of falls so catastrophic they feel like Greek tragedies played out under the California sun. We've heard so many of them, but there is one name, one story that resonates with a particular chill. It's the story of a woman who became a symbol, a feminist icon, a punk rock saint, a poster child for rebellion. But before she was any of those things, she was just a person, a woman of ferocious intelligence, breathtaking talent, and a spirit so uncompromising it seemed destined to collide with the world. Her name was Frances Farmer. To say her life was tragic is an understatement. It's a story that asks us uncomfortable questions. What is the true price of fame? What happens when a woman refuses to be silent? And how easily can a person's identity be erased, rewritten, and replaced by a legend? To understand Frances, you have to understand the worlds that shaped her. The first was Seattle in the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't a backwater town. It was a city of contradictions. It had a rugged frontier spirit and a history of radical labor movements like the Great General Strike of 1919. It was home to the University of Washington, a hub of progressive thought and intellectual ferment. But it was also a city of rigid, middle-class propriety, a place where social conventions were deeply entrenched. This was the environment that produced Frances, a place that encouraged bold ideas, but punished unconventional behavior. Her mother, Lillian, was a product of this environment's ambition. A fiercely determined woman, she operated a series of boarding houses and pushed her children relentlessly toward success. She saw in Frances a special spark, an intelligence and beauty that could be her ticket out, and perhaps Lillian's as well. But Lillian's ambition was a suffocating force, a constant pressure that would define their fraught relationship for the rest of their lives. The second world was Hollywood in its golden age. From the ashes of the Great Depression, the studio system rose like a glittering phoenix. It was a dream factory, churning out glamour and escapism for a nation desperate for both. But it was, in reality, a factory. The studios, run by powerful moguls like Adolph Zukor at Paramount and Louis B. Mayer at MGM, owned their stars, body and soul. Actors were signed to ironclad, 7-year contracts that contained the infamous morals clause, giving the studio the right to terminate them for any behavior that might bring scandal. The studio's publicity machine was a formidable beast. It created entire personas from scratch. It told stars who to date, what to wear, where to be seen. It planted fake stories in the gossip columns of Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons to build up an image. And, for young actresses, the path was brutally narrow. You were the girl next door, the bombshell, the elegant sophisticate. What you were not allowed to be was complicated, opinionated, or difficult. You were property. The final world that sealed Frances's fate was the world of mental health care in the 1940s. It was an era of profound ignorance. Mental illness was not seen as a medical condition, but as a moral failing, a weakness of character. For women, this was doubly true. Any deviation from expected feminine behavior, passion, anger, intellectual assertiveness, could be labeled as hysteria. The asylums of the day were not places of healing. They were human warehouses. Underfunded, overcrowded, and staffed by overworked and often cruel attendants, their primary function was to remove inconvenient people from society. The treatments were instruments of control, designed to break a patient's will. This was the world that awaited anyone who fell from grace. The first public declaration of the war Frances Farmer would wage against conformity came when she was just 16 years old. In 1931, as a student at West Seattle High School, She submitted an essay to a national contest run by Scholastic magazine. Its title was God Dies. It was not a simple atheistic rant. It was a deeply personal philosophical exploration of her own crisis of faith. She wrote, "I had to find a new God. I had to find a new foundation for my life." For her, the old comforting certainties had dissolved, leaving her in a state of spiritual solitude. It was a stunningly mature piece of writing for a teenager, and it won first prize. The $100 check was, however, accompanied by a firestorm of local outrage. The press seized upon the story. Headlines screamed about the godless girl of West Seattle. Church ministers used her as a cautionary tale in their sermons. She was branded a heretic, a dangerous radical. For a young girl, the public shaming was intense. But Frances did not back down. She defended her essay, her right to intellectual inquiry, her freedom to doubt. It was the first time she stood her ground against public opinion, and it was a pattern that would repeat with increasingly devastating consequences. This intellectual fire was nurtured at the University of Washington. She was a star of the drama department, a place where her intensity found a home. She wasn't just acting, she was dissecting plays, studying characters, and honing a raw, electrifying talent that set her apart. But her curiosity was not confined to the stage. In 1935, a leftist newspaper, The Voice of Action, sponsored a subscription-selling contest. The grand prize was a steamship ticket for a trip to the Soviet Union. For a young, politically aware student of history, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The USSR was the great social experiment of the age, and Frances, ever the empiricist, wanted to see it for herself. She won the contest, and against the strenuous objections of her mother, she went. This single act would haunt her for years. In an America increasingly paranoid about communism, this trip was seen as a definitive political statement. It marked her, placing her on the files of organizations that would later become the infamous House Un-American Activities Committee. For Frances, it was an educational journey. For her future enemies, it was proof of her suspect character. Upon her return, she set her sights on a professional acting career in New York. While preparing to leave, a Paramount Pictures talent scout spotted her in a university production. He was stunned. Here was a beauty that was natural and unforced, combined with an intelligence that radiated from the stage. She was offered a screen test and a 7-year contract. In 1936, the rebel from Seattle, the girl who had questioned God and visited the Soviet Union, arrived in Hollywood. The collision was immediate. Paramount saw in Frances Farmer the potential for a new Greta Garbo or Marlene Dietrich. They immediately set about packaging her. They wanted to portray her as a mysterious, sophisticated European type. The problem was that Frances was an unpretentious, intellectually honest woman from the Pacific Northwest who saw right through the charade. She refused to play the game. She drove a dusty old car, dressed down in simple clothes, and avoided the glitzy party circuit the studio demanded she attend. She found the endless publicity interviews, with their inane questions about her favorite foods and beauty secrets, to be an excruciating bore. She made her contempt known. When a reporter asked her a particularly silly question, she was known to just stare back in stony silence. Despite her difficult reputation, her talent was simply too immense to ignore. Her second film, 1936's Come and Get It, directed by the legendary Howard Hawks and William Wyler, should have cemented her stardom. She gave a brilliant, nuanced dual performance that earned rave reviews. Life magazine put her on its cover, declaring, "Frances Farmer is 1937's new star. She had everything Hollywood could offer, and she was miserable. She felt creatively stifled, intellectually starved. Hollywood is a celluloid strip of tawdry gossip, petty jealousies, and broken hearts, she once said. Her heart and mind long for the one place she felt she could do real work, the theater. So in 1937, she did the unthinkable. At the peak of her rising fame, she broke her contract and fled Hollywood for New York to join the legendary Group Theater. The Group Theater was the most exciting and artistically committed acting company in America, led by figures like Harold Clurman, Lee Strasberg, and Cheryl Crawford. They were champions of a new, psychologically realistic style of acting that would later be known as the method. They produced plays of social and political significance, most notably by their star playwright Clifford Odets. For Frances, this was paradise. Here, her intelligence wasn't a liability, it was an asset. Her intensity wasn't difficult, it was the core of her talent. She was cast as the lead in Odets's new play, Golden Boy. And she fell into a passionate, all-consuming affair with the charismatic playwright himself. She believed she had found her artistic and romantic home. She poured all of her hopes into Odets and the play. The play was a smash hit, and Frances's performance was hailed as a triumph. But her personal happiness was short-lived. Odets was married, and he was a notorious womanizer. He abruptly ended their affair, and in a final act of devastating cruelty, he had her replaced in the London production of the play. The betrayal shattered her. Heartbroken, humiliated, and with nowhere else to go, she was forced to crawl back to Hollywood, back to the very system she had so publicly scorned. The studios, now seeing her as humbled, took her back, but the dynamic had changed. She was no longer the brilliant new discovery. She was the difficult actress who had failed. They put her in a series of forgettable B-list movies. The work was uninspired, and Frances descended into a spiral of alcohol and Benzedrine, an amphetamine commonly prescribed by studio doctors to keep exhausted stars working. Her defiance, once a mark of integrity, now curdled into erratic and self-destructive behavior. The slow, painful unraveling had begun, and the vultures of the press were beginning to circle. The night that marked the beginning of the end came on October 19th, 1942. The United States was deep into World War II, and coastal cities like Santa Monica were subject to strict nighttime dim-out regulations to guard against potential enemy attack. Frances was driving home when a police officer pulled her over for having her headlights on bright. What followed was a perfect storm of her volatile temper, her contempt for authority, and the escalating effects of alcohol and pills. The routine traffic stop exploded into a furious argument. According to the police report, she was verbally abusive and uncooperative. She was arrested. The next morning's court appearance was a disaster. She appeared belligerent and disheveled. She talked back to the judge, demanded a phone call, and when things didn't go her way, she reportedly threw an inkwell at him, shouting, "Have you ever had a broken heart?" The judge, showing no mercy, sentenced her to 180 days in the county jail. The headlines were merciless. "Frances Farmer jailed," they screamed, accompanied by a haggard, unflattering mugshot. The glamour was gone. The beautiful star had become a common criminal, a public spectacle. For Paramount Pictures, this was the final straw. Citing the morals clause in her contract, they officially terminated their relationship with Frances Farmer. At the age of 29, her career in Hollywood was over, but her public humiliation and her long journey into the abyss was just getting started. After serving her time, Frances was adrift. Blacklisted by the studios and haunted by her public disgrace, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. There were reports of her working as a hotel laundress, then of a drunken altercation at a bar. In January 1943, she was arrested again after physically assaulting a hairdresser at the studio where she was working on her final low-budget film. When the police arrived at her hotel to take her into custody, she refused to come out. What ensued was a chaotic, violent scene. Police had to physically break down the door and drag her out, half naked and screaming, through the lobby. This was the moment her mother, Lillian, intervened. Convinced that Frances was having a complete mental breakdown, Lillian Farmer made the most fateful decision of her daughter's life. She initiated legal proceedings to have Frances declared mentally incompetent. Armed with a psychiatrist's diagnosis of manic depressive psychosis, Lillian was granted guardianship. Frances was now a ward of the state, her civil rights stripped away. She was forcibly committed to a private sanatorium in the San Fernando Valley. In her autobiography, Will There Really Be a Morning?, she describes the experience with visceral horror. She recounts being subjected to insulin shock therapy, a brutal and dangerous procedure. Patients were injected with massive overdoses of insulin, causing them to fall into a coma and experience violent convulsions. The theory was that this reboot of the nervous system could cure mental illness. The reality was a terrifying ordeal that could cause brain damage or even death. Frances, ever defiant, escaped. She fled to her half-sister's house, but her mother tracked her down. This time, there would be no private facility. Frances was committed to the Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington. It was a massive, fortress-like state asylum, a place from which there would be no easy escape. She entered its doors in May of 1944. She would not emerge for nearly 5 years. The conditions inside Western State were something out of a nightmare. It was chronically underfunded, dangerously overcrowded, and staffed by poorly paid orderlies who often resorted to violence to control the thousands of patients. The prevailing philosophy was not treatment, but custody and control. And the tools of control were medieval. Frances was subjected to hydrotherapy. This could mean being strapped into a tub of ice-cold water for hours on end, or being tightly wrapped in freezing, wet canvas sheets and left immobile for an entire day. It was a form of sensory deprivation and physical torment designed to induce submission. She also endured dozens of rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Without the use of anesthesia or muscle relaxants, which are standard today, the procedure was terrifying and violent. A powerful electric current was passed through the brain, inducing a grand mal seizure. Patients would often bite through their tongues or even fracture bones from the force of the convulsions. The primary side effect was memory loss, a literal erasure of the self. In her memoir, Frances describes the soul-crushing despair of life in the asylum, the loss of identity, the constant fear, the endless monotonous days punctuated by moments of sheer terror. She wrote of the experience, "It is a muffled, helpless rage that strips the mind of all its reason and leaves it a naked, quivering organism of pure terror." Yet, even in this hellscape, her spirit was not entirely extinguished. There are accounts, small fragments of her unbroken will, that survive. One of the most telling is the story of her time working in the hospital's laundry. It was grueling, steamy, menial work, but it was a small pocket of routine in the chaos. And there, amidst the din of the machines, Frances reportedly began to do what she had always done. She began to organize. She argued for better conditions for the other patient workers. She advocated for small dignities. Even when stripped of everything, she remained at her core a fighter. But this resistance was a double-edged sword. To the hospital staff, her defiance wasn't a sign of a sane mind fighting an injustice. It was merely another symptom of her illness. The more she raged against her confinement, the more treatment she received. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. The very qualities that had made her a star, her fire, her intelligence, her refusal to be silenced, were now the justifications for her torture. For 5 years, the world outside went on, while Frances Farmer disappeared into the belly of the beast. It is impossible to discuss Frances Farmer's time at Western State Hospital without confronting the darkest part of her legend, the lobotomy. The word itself conjures images of horror: an ice pick, a hammer, a mind deliberately and irrevocably broken. The idea that Frances was subjected to this procedure is the cornerstone of her modern myth. It's the ultimate symbol of her martyrdom. But a careful examination of the historical record reveals a far more complicated and debatable story. The narrative of Frances's lobotomy was burned into the public consciousness by one book, Shadowland, a 1978 biography by Seattle journalist William Arnold. The book paints a lurid and sensational picture of her life, culminating in a graphic, horrifying account of Frances being dragged into a surgery room and given a transorbital lobotomy, the infamous ice pick procedure pioneered by Dr. Walter Freeman. Arnold presents this as the ultimate act of patriarchal punishment, the final silencing of a defiant woman. The book was a commercial success and became the primary source for the 1982 Jessica Lange film, Frances, which powerfully dramatized the scene. For millions, this became the undisputed truth. The problem is, the evidence supporting this claim is virtually non-existent. Meticulous research by subsequent biographers, most notably Jeffrey Kaufman in his book Shedding Light on Shadowland, has systematically debunked the lobotomy claim. Kaufman conducted an exhaustive search of the Western State Hospital archives. While lobotomies were performed there, they were major surgical procedures that left an extensive paper trail, including surgical reports, consent forms, and recovery notes. There is not a single document in the hospital's records to suggest Frances Farmer ever underwent this surgery. Furthermore, Dr. Walter Freeman, the leading proponent and practitioner of the transorbital lobotomy, kept his own detailed logs of every single procedure he performed. Frances Farmer's name does not appear in his records. Kaufman also interviewed hospital staff who worked there during Frances's time. None of them had any memory of her being lobotomized. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against the claim comes from Frances herself. After her final release, she went on to host a live television show for 6 years. Colleagues and viewers described her as intelligent, witty, and articulate with a sharp memory. These are cognitive abilities that are often severely compromised by a frontal lobotomy. While she was undoubtedly scarred by her experiences, she did not present as a woman whose frontal lobes had been surgically scrambled. So, if it almost certainly didn't happen, why is the lobotomy myth so powerful and persistent? Because it provides a simple, dramatic explanation for a complex and messy reality. The myth casts Frances as a pure martyr and the psychiatric establishment as a monolithic villain. It's a clean narrative. The truth is far more disturbing. The horror of Frances Farmer's story does not require the invention of a lobotomy. The documented, undisputed treatments she did endure were, in themselves, instruments of torture. The hours spent in ice baths, the violent insulin-induced comas, the dozens of memory-wiping electroshocks, these things really happened. They were standard procedure. The tragedy of Frances Farmer isn't that she was the exception. It's that in many ways, she was the rule. Her story is terrifying not because of a secret, shadowy crime, but because of the horrors that were committed in plain sight, under the guise of medicine. To focus on the lobotomy myth is to risk obscuring this real documented brutality. It also oversimplifies Frances herself. She was not just a passive victim. She was a brilliant but deeply troubled woman, likely suffering from a severe mental illness like bipolar disorder, which was tragically misunderstood at the time. Her alcoholism was a disease, not just a moral failing. Her story is a tangled knot of systemic abuse, personal demons, and a society completely unequipped to help a woman like her. The truth is messy, uncomfortable, and it offers no easy answers. In 1950, after nearly 5 years in Western State, Frances was quietly released into the care of her mother. She was 36 years old. The fiery, beautiful star was gone, replaced by a subdued woman with haunted eyes. She took a series of menial jobs, working in hotels and photo labs, living a life of quiet anonymity. The world seemed to have forgotten her. Then, in 1957, a producer for the popular television show This Is Your Life tracked her down. The show's format was to surprise a guest by ambushing them with a live televised walk through their past, complete with friends and family from different eras. For Frances, this meant a public reunion with the ghosts that had haunted her for decades. Her appearance on the show is a stunning piece of television history. She is introduced as a hotel clerk, and as the host, Ralph Edwards, reveals her true identity. A look of profound shock and vulnerability crosses her face. She chain smokes nervously throughout the broadcast. Edwards tiptoes around the dark years, euphemistically referring to her time in the asylum as a period of long illness and deep despair. One by one, people from her past are brought out. A childhood friend, her university drama coach, her ex-husband Leif Erikson. With each appearance, Frances musters a smile, but her eyes betray a deep-seated pain. It is a spectacle of forced reconciliation, a public performance of a redemption arc. The show was a sensation. America loves a comeback story, and Frances's was one for the ages. The wave of public sympathy led to a genuine second act. She was offered a job hosting an afternoon movie program in Indianapolis. From 1958 to 1964, Frances Farmer Presents was a local television staple. She introduced classic films, conducted interviews, and, by all accounts, handled her duties with professionalism and grace. She had found a measure of peace, a quiet harbor far from the storms of her past. But the scars remained. She continued to battle alcoholism, and her old demons would occasionally surface. After a series of on-air incidents, she was fired in 1964. Her final years were spent in relative obscurity. She attempted to capture her story in her autobiography, Will There Really Be a Morning? A raw, powerful, but often factually unreliable account of her life. Frances Farmer died of esophageal cancer on August 1, 1970. She was 56. She was buried in a small cemetery in Fishers, Indiana, a world away from the Hollywood that had once promised her everything. But her story did not die with her. In the decades that followed, it was resurrected and remade. The publication of Shadowland and the release of the film Frances transformed her into a cultural icon. She became a potent symbol for a new generation. Feminists saw her as a woman destroyed for being too intelligent and too independent. The punk and grunge movements embraced her as a patron saint of anti-establishment rage. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, a fellow troubled soul from Washington State, was famously obsessed with her story. He wrote the searing song, Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle, and gave his own daughter the name Frances. Her life became a canvas onto which others could project their own fears and anger about conformity, psychiatry, and the abuse of power. Her significance today lies less in the film she made and more in the enduring power of her story as a cautionary tale. It forces us to look at the dark side of celebrity, at the brutal history of mental health care, and at the timeless struggle of the individual against a society that demands they fit in. Her story is a chilling, timeless warning. It speaks to the danger of silencing those who challenge us and the profound responsibility we have to treat those who are suffering with compassion and understanding, not with judgment and brutality. Frances Farmer's life was a desperate search for a place where her brilliant, fiery spirit could exist without being extinguished. She never found it, and we are left with the haunting echo of a voice that was, in the end, silenced, and a legend that tells only half of a devastatingly human story. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.